Okay, colleagues, we continue our meeting. I switch into Polish. Please put your headphones on. Otherwise, yeah, you can take mine. Otherwise, you will be forced to listen it in my beautiful Polish language. Okay. Szanowne koleżanki, szanowni koledzy, przystępujemy do
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, we'll start now the hearing. That's point 6, women's reproductive health and specificities, including sexual and reproductive health and rights and access to abortion. Today, I would like to welcome 4 experts. We will hear their presentations. We've decided to organize this hearing as it comes close to the International Safe Abortion Day, which will happen in 9 days on the 28th of September. So I guess it's the right time to remind of this important topic. This is something that affects millions of women who live in Europe today. It's a topic that we've discussed on numerous occasions. It's been subject to a debate many times. And this is a topic that is very interesting. The European Parliament's stance is clear. This is the position that we have adopted on numerous occasions. Let me just remind you that reproductive health has been a target of many so-called anti-gender movements, and women's rights in many countries have been limited in terms of their reproductive rights. And I come from Poland myself, so after the last ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal, we have the situation in Poland in which women in Poland cannot use their right to abortion. In 2019, for example, in Poland, 1,100 abortions happened officially, and there are 40 million people living in Poland, and this is official data, and many women do that illegally in a dangerous way. And today, last year, 2022, it was only 161 women who had their pregnancies terminated, and 40 million people living in Poland, and it's girls and women who pay the highest price for these changes in law. So this is what we'll be discussing today with our experts. Fred Matic is also here with us, who deals with this topic. He's the author of a famous report on reproductive rights. So Fred, a very warm welcome to you as well. But it's our experts that are real stars of today, and let me introduce them, starting from my right. For my left, Birgit van Hout, Director, Representation Office in Brussels, UN Population Fund, UNFPA. It's a very well-known fund. We know it because we've had representatives of this fund in this committee. It is the United Nations Sexual Reproductive Health Agency, which works in 150 countries worldwide. Then Dr. Jasenka Grujcic, a PhD specialist in gynecology and obstetrics from Croatia. She is famous for her defense of women's rights, including the right to abortion. Thank you for being with us. Next, Camille Gervais. No, I'm sorry. Next one is Laia Sanchez. She's an integrative gynecologist and founder of Alma by Women, an integrative health clinic in Spain. A very warm welcome. Thank you for being with us. And the last expert, she'll take the floor as the first one, Camille Gervais, legal advisor for Europe's Center for Reproductive Rights. It's a global human rights organization that we know very well. It is an association of lawyers and advocates fighting for reproductive rights. Ladies and gentlemen, so let us begin. Each of you will have 7 minutes, and then we'll open the debate, and all the colleagues will participate in the discussion. We'll have an exchange of opinions. Let me start with Birgit van Hout. and you have 7 minutes. And then next experts, over to you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair, honourable members of the FEM Committee, ladies and gentlemen. I want to express my gratitude, first of all, to this committee for its unwavering support for women and girls. And I would like to thank the FEM Committee in particular for inviting me to be with you today. My focus will be on the global dimension of sexual and reproductive health and rights, which I will refer to as SRHR. The United Nations Population Fund, as our dear chair explained, operates in over 150 countries to bring about a world where every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, women are free from violence, and the potential of every young person is realized. In humanitarian settings, where SRHR has traditionally been an afterthought, let's be honest, we set up emergency delivery rooms when maternity wards are bombed, and we dispatch hospitalers for rape survivors, like in Ukraine. In Afghanistan, we run one of the largest humanitarian operations providing safe childbirth and psychosocial support for women and girls, which is literally a lifeline for thousands of pregnant women and a massive number of young girls thinking of committing suicide in Afghanistan. In both humanitarian and development contexts, we partner with civil society, especially women and youth organizations. However, it is crucial to recognize that the primary responsibility for upholding human rights lies with states. In 1994, in Cairo, 179 countries reached a consensus at the International Conference on Population and Development, the ICPD, to place women's reproductive health, including family planning and sexuality education, at the heart of development. In 2015, these commitments were largely integrated into the Sustainable Development Agenda, complete with targets and indicators to track progress towards the 2030 goals. So where do we stand midway through the Sustainable Development Agenda? Target 3.1 aimed to reduce maternal mortality to less than 70 per 100,000 live births. Sadly, zero progress since 2015, and even regression by double digits in some regions like the Americas, disproportionately affecting racial and ethnic minorities like women and girls of African descent. Shockingly, 1 woman dies every 2 minutes from entirely preventable pregnancy and childbirth-related causes, and many more suffer life-altering injuries like obstetric fistula. Women and girls with this debilitating condition tend to be stigmatized, abandoned by their husbands, and ostracized by their communities. Yet obstetric fistula can be repaired through surgery, and there are some small glimmers of hope. In West Africa, for example, we've been advocating with the Ministries of Health, together with some European ambassadors and the private sector, to do more. And as a result, several countries are now pledging to allocate domestic resources. Target 3.7 of the Sustainable Development Agenda calls for universal, which means 100% access to family planning and modern contraception. Unfortunately, global progress has been really slow, with access increasing by only 1%, from 76% in 2015 to 77% today. And it is projected to increase to 78%, meaning just 1 more percentage point by 2030. Sub-Saharan Africa lags most behind, but the increase from 51 to 57% clearly shows that the problem is solvable. And the UNFPA Supplies Partnership, in which the EU is a key partner, has contributed to these gains. Sustainable Development Goal 5, dedicated to gender equality, is entirely off track. Target 5.3 commits to eliminating harmful practices. Yet child marriage persists, with 1 in 5 girls becoming child brides and forced marriages of girls under 14 on the rise. Conflicts, the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, and climate change further put in danger an additional 10 million girls. Eradicating harmful practices requires an intricate long-term labor of social norms change. And while we've made strides against female genital mutilation, population growth in high prevalence countries is offsetting the gains that we've made. Indicator 5.6.1 measures the agency of married women or women living in partnership to make decisions about sexual relations, family planning, and contraception. Shockingly, 44% of women with partners lack the ability to make these choices. This lack of agency illustrates the clear link between SRHR and the struggle for women's rights and gender equality more generally. Gender equality remains far off, possibly taking another 300 years to achieve at the current rate. At the SDG summit taking place in New York, government leaders will hopefully decide to rescue the Sustainable Development Agenda. But we rely on parliaments to hold executive branches to account for their human rights obligations, both domestically and internationally. Only parliaments can ensure this accountability. And that is what makes your political support for SRHR across party lines vital. Therefore, we urge the FEM Committee to play an active role in evaluating the Gender Action Plan 3 in EU external action, to ensure that SRHR are incorporated in country-level action plans, or CLIPs, that gender focal points are appointed in all EU delegations, that SRHR are systematically raised in political and human rights dialogues with partner countries, and that funding targets are met. We look forward as UNFPA to partner with the European Union on the Global Gateway Team Europe initiative for SRHR in sub-Saharan Africa, where our experience in the region and our relationship with the African regional commissions can add significant value. But more generally, we call for the establishment of a multi-stakeholder advisory group for global gateway initiatives, which would include the United Nations and civil society, to ensure that all available experience and expertise is tapped into for the conceptualization of these initiatives upstream, and not only for implementation downstream. That is, if we want the global gateway initiatives to be truly transformative and sustainable. A model already exists in the Global Gateway Business Advisory Group. The FEM Committee can also influence EU funding for SRHR, where intentions translate into action, results, and impact. In recent years, EU financial support for SRHR has increased slightly in absolute terms, but decreased as a proportion of official development assistance, or ODA. In fact, the EU ranks 22nd out of 30 OAC DAC donors for SRHR, lagging far behind countries like the Netherlands, Sweden, and Luxembourg, which allocate an almost 4 times higher proportion of their official development assistance to SRHR. We also face challenges with the EU's strictly project-based funding model. Multi-year core funding for organizations like ours would enable us to respond swiftly to crises and catastrophes, remain engaged in protracted conflicts, and support advocacy efforts while reducing transaction costs. Around 70 states pledge core support for agencies of the United Nations, and in our case for UNFPA. So we wonder, why can't the European Union do the same? The review of the EU multi-annual financial framework, the MFF, including the Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument and DICI Global Europe, presents a significant opportunity for this committee. More funding for the Global Challenges thematic program could position the EU as a global leader on SRHR and allow for continued investment in initiatives like the Supplies Partnership and the Maternal Health Fund, for which it has proven so difficult to mobilize support. Today, as the Chair mentioned, we are facing a global backlash against SRHR, which is also tangible in multilateral fora. This makes the EU's principled stance on SRHR all the more essential. Soon, the 30th anniversary of the International Conference on Population and Development is coming up, and the need for a renewed global political consensus has never been greater. We invite the European Parliament and the FEM Committee in particular to the International Parliamentarians Conference on the implementation of the ICPD Programme of Action, which will take place in Oslo from 10 to 12 April 2024, to take stock on where we are and chart the way forward in these highly complex times. Now is a pivotal moment to forge effective alliances to tilt the balance in the right direction. Time is of the essence, as the consequences of inaction are high for women and girls, and indeed for all of us. Without SRHR, women cannot fully enjoy any other human right. We need your leadership as democratically elected representatives to champion SRHR in Europe and globally. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. What an intervention. Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Director. So we continue with Dr. Jasenka Grujcic from Croatia. The floor is yours, Doctor. Put your mic on, because you need to put your mic on.
Ah,
Yes.
oh, thank you very much. Dakle, okay, thank you. Dakle, zahvalna sam što ste...
I would like to thank you for inviting me, and I'm always touched when hearing this data from the world, and I'm aware of the task that is ahead. Let me illustrate the situation in Croatia. Please, next slide. The title of my presentation is, could you go back one slide? So the title is Zagreb Brežice, 50 kilometers away, 100 years of solitude. Brežice is a small town next to the Croatian border, 50 kilometers away from Zagreb, and I will explain this expression, 100 years of solitude, during my presentation. Next slide, please. I dedicate this presentation to all women who had to, or for various reasons wanted to, seek help with termination of pregnancy abroad. Next slide, please. The Croatian gynecology and obstetrics have a long and illustrious history. In 1983, the first child conceived by assisted fertilization was born. It was the seventh child born in this way in the world. Next slide, please. The right to decide freely on the birth of children was incorporated into the legislation of Yugoslavia briefly after the Second World War, and it was guaranteed by the 1974 Constitution. And in 1978, this was incorporated in the law on health measures for exercising the right to free decision on having children. This law is still in force in Croatia, as it is in Slovenia as well. The law on medicine was promulgated in 2003, and this legalized the conscientious objection in medicine. So, conscientious objection, a religious institute, was incorporated into the legislation of a secular country. This objection, the refusal to do duty and denying care after abortion, is opposed to women's reproductive rights, first and foremost abortion, and recently now even contraception. So those women who want to have an abortion are being stigmatized, as are those who perform abortions. Next slide, please. On this occasion, I wanted to illustrate the situation in Croatia by analyzing the situation in certain institutions, but owing to the goodness of my colleagues, I have been able to obtain the data on women who perform abortions in Slovenia. I focused in my research on 2022. in Croatia, we had 3,041 elective abortions. 207 women from Croatia terminated their pregnancy in 2022 in the General Hospital of Brežice in Slovenia. This data may not seem important to you, but when we compare this to the population in Croatia, this is a significant piece of information, especially because we know that this data hides possibly some information that we will never learn. Next slide, please. Based on the law on the right of access to information, I sent inquiries to relevant institutions on the availability of abortion care, on the procedures, and also on the denial of abortion. So I had to resort to the law to obtain some information that my colleagues are very unwilling to provide. Thank you. Next slide. Yes. Out of 30 authorized institutions, 6 of them turned a deaf ear to my request. After resorting to a lawyer, one of them sent this information, but too late to insert them in my presentation. I will continue to do research, and I will submit to this committee the result of my research. In 3 out of 24 authorized institutions, abortion care was not provided in 2022. In 2022, in 8 out of 24 institutions, no medical abortions were performed. In 6 out of 24 institutions, no surgical abortions were not performed in 2022. We could discuss at length why this is happening, but unfortunately, my time is limited. In 11 out of 24 institutions, the women could not choose the method, and I'm making the example here of universities' clinics. So in 5 out of 7 university clinics, 60 to 83% of gynecologists expressed a denial of abortion care. In 1 of these institutions, none of them refused abortion care, and in 1 of them, 29% of doctors did so. Next slide, please. Of course, this division is not something to be wished for. I criticize the medical community for bowing their head to attitudes that deny the rights to women, right to reproductive and health care. The medical community has not been able to improve the availability of standard medical procedures and care. The Croatian health insurance does not cover abortion costs, unlike the Slovenian one. And until we've resolved this, we cannot discuss availability of abortion. Those of us who advocate reproductive health in Croatia, I hope with your help, will be able to end this trend of unavailability and untransparency of reproductive health care. I personally hope that the independent performance of medical abortion will be adopted as an acceptable model of abortion care. So every woman who is forced to leave her country to get abortion care, to interrupt her pregnancy, feels as if she were in 100 years of solitude. So there is a long path from the existent reproductive health care in Croatia and Slovenia, which is only 50 kilometers away from Zagreb. There is really a long distance between those two. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grujic. Thank you for your presentation. And I just want to inform you that at the end of October, we will have a fact-finding mission to Croatia to find
wonderful.
out the situation in the ground. So probably we'll meet again to go deeper into what your presentation. I encourage my colleagues, if anyone wants to participate in this mission, there's still a chance to join us. So we move now to Laila Sanchez, another doctor in our expertise room, who is a founder of Alma by Women. The floor is yours, doctor.
Thank you. Bueno, buenos días.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to today's meeting. I am a gynecologist who's specialized in hormones and also in adolescent gynecology. And I'd like to talk today about the need for comprehensive sex and emotional education, including period education, which is an essential factor. We can move on to the next slide, please. In a survey carried out in 2019, more than 2,000 Spanish teenagers were asked what they thought of the sex education they had received. 68%, so almost 70% of those surveyed, said that they thought it was insufficient. Next slide, please. Sexual health is a human right. So that means having access to sex education, not just biology lessons, is important. They need to know what kind of risks and consequences there are in sexual behavior. And they need to look at what to include in this training. Next slide. I always say that sex education starts at home, starts in the cradle. Babies need mothers, so mothers need to protect babies right through from childbirth. And this then sees teenagers will have a sex life, but they'll be able to be free from depression if it starts early enough. And we also need to have a healthy sexual life in adulthood. We see many changes in growth and development in our adolescence. The social, cultural, and family life influences this, and this will lead to a biopsychosocial transformation. Next slide, please. Because human beings are biopsychosocial beings, and sexuality develops in us from when we're born. Reproduction is part of sexuality, but it's not just about intercourse. It's also pregnancy. It's also childbirth. It's also breastfeeding. So sex education needs to include all of these things. Next slide, please. We know that adolescents, because of their characteristics, are a population at risk. Often they suffer the risks of sexual relationships, whether they could be called risky relationships or irresponsible relationships. 50% of the new cases of STIs are among teenagers or people from 15 to 25. And in the chance of reinfection is up to 40% in the first year. And these data here are similar to other high-income countries. This is Spain and Catalonia. But this is about abortion. And this is teen pregnancy. Here we can see the data on the screen, and this reflects the reality of adolescents, the lack of knowledge they have of their menstrual cycle, and there's a lack of information about access to early assistance and reproductive health care, and the negative consequences of being pregnant and breaking taboos, of course. There's also lack of perception about fertility. Next slide, please. And other data is contraception. This depends on each autonomous community in Spain. Each autonomous community has different methods of funding. And in 2017, the figure in Spain wasn't even 60% contraception rate. This rate has improved since then, and so we're now up to 69%. But perhaps coincidentally, the rate of abortions has actually decreased with this increase. Next slide, please. Another potential risk. Next slide, please. So following slide, please. And the previous one, please. Another aspect of irresponsible sex life is sexual violence, and we don't speak much about this. We often think of sex is synonymous with pleasure without any pressure, but this is very far removed from reality. We're seeing sexual violence, especially among minors and teenagers, is very problematic. Here there is a graph, like a pie chart. This is data from Catalonia, and this is data up to 2022. Up to 40% of victims of sexual violence are minors, underage. So you can see that there is a repressive, hypersexualized vision of women, and women are subject to this. Often there is myths of romance and porn culture, which leads to the objectification of women. And also, one of the main sources of sex education, more than 65%, have already consumed pornography. So pornography is the main source of sex education for many people. We need to allow our teenagers to be free of sexual repression, but we can prevent sexual violence and previous slide, please, and pressure. We need to have a comprehensive sex and emotional education. We need to empower our own health, including sexual health. We need to take decisions based on information, and we also need to be consistent in these decisions. We need to include menstruation periods in this education as well. This is a key part of human dignity. We know that topics such as sexual freedom, male violence, and abuse are issues which are not dealt with in that kind of information. Can we skip 2 slides, please? The next one, and then the next one. The next one. So menstruation is a physiological process which affects the half of the world's population for around 40 years of their lives. And it is a very important aspect, and it needs to be free of taboos. But what is the reality? Can you go to the next slide, please? The next slide is that 94% of women between 10 and 20 have period pains, and 91% of those women play down those symptoms, and they don't believe that they will need to have medical assistance. And often women go through 5 years of medical visits without actually receiving a diagnosis. And girls will often miss 1 to 4 days a month because of period pains, and this has an impact on their school performance, and this increases the gender gap. The reality is chronic period pains is the main risk factor in anxiety and depression among teenagers, and this means that teenagers can then be subject to various types of violence. We've seen data support this in humanitarian crises, child marriage, forced marriage, and disability, gender identity, many factors. And this leads to stigma around periods. And it makes it difficult for teenage girls to exercise their rights. Next slide, please. So, period education is a sexual right because the menstrual cycle is a vital sign, and to prevent pathologies and disorders among women, not just in gynecological health. Period education allows us to break with taboos in society, discrimination and gender-based violence for many reasons. Next slide, please. So if we don't talk about periods, all this does is actually sustain these negative stereotypes and attitudes. Therefore, we can't talk about sexual health without talking about period health, and therefore we cannot allow the menstrual health to deteriorate. The abortion law has changed in Spain, and this is a commitment to protecting sexual and reproductive rights of women and to fight for this comprehensive sex and emotional education, which is very important. So our teenagers will see improvements to safe abortions. They'll see a reduction in regional differences and inequalities in access to abortion, and we'll see better access to contraception as well. And hope this comprehensive sex and emotional education will be a key measure to prevent gender-based violence and gender inequality. Next slide, please. There are many things that need to be done. In Catalonia, where I work, this year we started a program where we urge women to use environmentally friendly hygiene materials. So we also provide contraception, which is free until the age of 29. And there's also a framework for abortions. We also want to provide assistance with sexual and reproductive health, consultations for people under the age of 25 for sexual health and gynecological problems, special consultations in different hospitals, and also continuous education and training on sexual health and gynecology for professionals. To conclude, and the next slide, please. Defending reproductive rights and sexual rights for women and periods as part of their biology helps to combat violence, to end gender-based stereotypes, the normalization of symptoms, and also improve treatment and diagnosis for women. The hormonal cycle can impact women's health, and what we need to do is stop the research, the gender gap in research as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Laia Sanchez. Really interesting, listen to you. And now we go further with the next speaker. I will say welcome to Ms. Camille Gervais. The word is yours.
Honourable Chair, honourable members of the FEM Committee of the European Parliament, thank you for inviting the Centre for Reproductive Rights to present before this committee on this important matter. As many of you know, the Centre works across Europe and other regions to advance laws and policies on sexual and reproductive health and rights and prevent backsliding. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. In the short time we have, I want to briefly capture some of the key trends and concerns in relation to sexual and reproductive health and rights in Europe. And first, I think it's important to underscore that the trend in the region is broadly progressive. So since 2018, as you can see on the slide, over 15 countries have liberalized their abortion laws by removing bans and access barriers. Next slide, please. Since 2020, states are also increasingly adopting laws and policies mandating free or subsidized access to contraception and to ensure that all women have equal access, including lesbian couples, to assisted reproductive technologies. But despite all of this, there is still significant need in every EU member state for further progressive reform so that sexual and reproductive health and rights are fully realized for women in Europe. And as other speakers have mentioned, we are witnessing backlash and regressions in some parts of the EU, which have a significant effect on women's access to healthcare. Continued progress is the most effective way of tackling these regressive threats. So international human rights law clearly prohibits states from taking deliberately retrogressive measures when it comes to existing rights. Unfortunately, legislators and governments in some EU countries have not adhered to these obligations and have actively rolled back existing entitlements. I will focus on regression on abortion access, and then I will give a few examples of regression in other areas of reproductive health care. On abortion, most of the time, eradicating entitlements is slow. It can be insidious, starting with seemingly harmless rhetoric and the spread of misinformation at first, but very quickly over time, it shifts into concrete attempts to roll back entitlements. Often, attacks on sexual and reproductive health and rights go hand in hand with attacks on democratic principles and the rule of law. And this is clear from what has happened in relation to abortion in Poland, in Hungary, and in Slovakia. Next slide, please. So when it comes to Poland, as the chair recalled in the beginning of this presentation, the law was already one of the most restrictive in Europe. And as you know, there were repeated attempts over many years to ban abortion fully. These were combined with successful efforts to dismantle the independence of the judiciary, and that culminated in 2020 with Poland becoming the only EU member state in recent history to remove a ground for legal abortion from its laws. So now we have a de facto ban on abortion in place. This is having very grave impacts on the lives, health, and well-being of women in Poland. Next slide, please. In Hungary, incremental regression has occurred over time. In 2000, the government introduced regressive restrictions on access to abortion, namely a mandatory waiting period and mandatory bias counseling. Then in 2011, the revised constitution explicitly protected life from conception. And last year, as many of you know, a ministerial decree introduced a requirement obliging women to listen to the fetal ultrasound prior to abortion. Next slide, please. In Slovakia, again, regressive threats have come in waves. So in 2009, laws introduced new regressive requirements prior to abortion, such as a mandatory waiting period. And since 2018, over 20 regressive draft bills seeking to place new limits on access to abortion have been tabled repeatedly by anti-abortion parliamentarians. The most recent was just a few months ago. They have been rejected each time, but the votes have been very close. So as I mentioned, not only abortion, but also other aspects of women's healthcare have been targeted. Next slide, please. For example, in 2017, legislation in Poland abolished the sale of emergency contraception over the counter by reintroducing the requirement for a prescription. And recently in Italy, the central government has required local governments to remove the recognition of legal parenthood for non-biological mothers of children born from IVF. Next slide, please. Backlash is also affecting civil society and human rights defenders working on sexual and reproductive health and rights. For example, in Poland, where not only has regression led to healthcare being limited, but it also led on clampdown on human rights defenders working on reproductive rights. In March 2023, Justyna Wydrinska, whom you know, she spoke before this committee, was officially convicted for the crime of helping with an abortion. This was the first prosecution of its kind in the EU. And other human rights defenders in Poland and elsewhere are facing prosecution for the organization of abortion rights protests and for simply defending the right to abortion. So what can the EU institutions do to ensure that we continue to make progress on women's reproductive health and address the regression that has occurred and the threats that remained? Thank you. First, it is paramount to strengthen legal and policy protection of sexual and reproductive health and rights at EU level based on public health standards. The EU can do much more under its existing competencies on a number of issues pertaining to sexual and reproductive health and rights. Then there must be stronger and more consistent action by EU institutions when threats of backsliding and regression occurs. This should involve close monitoring of the threats, early warning mechanisms, and the full use of the rule of law toolbox to address them. Finally, human rights defenders and civil society organizations working on sexual and reproductive health and rights need increased political backing and financial support as they continue to confront many challenges and are at the forefront of efforts to advance sexual and reproductive health and rights. I want to close by saying the most effective way to counter regression is ensuring that progress continues. We know there is currently potential for progressive reform in Denmark, in Germany, in Ireland, among others. We know that the EU is negotiating a very important legislation on women's rights. It is critical to use these processes to continue advancing sexual and reproductive health and rights, as we have seen that standing still is not an option. And in the meantime, we have to stand in solidarity with human rights defenders and civil society in those countries that are bearing the brunt of regression. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Camille Gervais, for your intervention, and to all of you for your all of you had excellent interventions. I myself really appreciated that, and I'm sure my colleagues as well. I mentioned my colleagues because now is the time for them to intervene, ask questions, make comments, and I have a whole list of my colleagues wishing to take the floor, and we go group by group first, and then I open the floor for the rest of my colleagues. And the first one is my colleague from EPP, Isabella Adinolfi, for 2.5 minutes each.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. Today we focus mainly on the right to abortion, and as you know, we've been fighting together for years because it is a right, and as such it must be guaranteed to every EU woman, citizens. But if we want to talk about the overall dimension of reproductive rights of women, we have to start from two different points. First is that not every woman are the same in Europe. They don't all have the same rights in Europe. Secondly, some problems are hardly ever faced up to, and as legislators, we must make efforts to be clearer in our texts. Why am I saying this? First of all, as the second category, the issues that are very often not talked about in texts of law is the issue of contraception. Access to contraception is not the same throughout the EU for an economic issue because costs vary widely, for a cultural issue because not all gynecologists are the same from country to country, and even within the same countries, sometimes they're really widely differently positioned. And then there's an educational issue. Teenagers are not informed. I was talking in Naples with one of the largest hospitals in the south of Italy for STDs, and I had the same results as you just expounded on, Dr. Sanchez, and then not all women are the same because there are illnesses that are not talked about, such as endometriosis, which is relatively newly talked about. And then there's an issue not just of the taboos of intercourse, but also becoming mothers. European women are becoming mothers later and later in life, but there is no homogeneous policy on cryoconservation of the ova. We need to insert and write the educational part in our textual law because gynecologists must be obliged to tell women and advise them to save their ova given our birth decline. And there are no rights for single women in a lot of countries. A lot of Italian women, for example, go to Spain to get IVFs. This is a very interesting debate because it's given us a lot of food for thought. But let me ask everyone to make efforts to be as explicit as possible and try and insert in our text as many issues as possible. Thank you, Ms. Adinolfi. The next up is SND. Fred Matic.
Hvala, Robert.
Thank you very much, Robert. I would like to thank all the experts who provided us with very useful information today. As you know, this committee pays a lot of attention to sexual and reproductive rights, especially the right to abortion, and I'm very pleased that today we have yet another opportunity to discuss this issue and an opportunity to emphasize that women still do not have the rights to this, which is one of the human rights. I was especially alarmed by the presentation of Dr. Grujic. We are often here discussing the situation in Hungary, Poland or Malta, and some small countries such as Croatia fall under the radar. And there, although the legislation is in place, in reality it is very difficult to exercise this right. Sexual and reproductive rights are among fundamental human rights. This is not an ideological issue. This is the public health issue, and this is how we will continue to approach it. So here in the Parliament, we voted on the resolution 2 years ago where we voiced very clearly our demands and we addressed the Commission and the national governments. Unfortunately, 2 years later, not much has changed. We still do not have European standards in this field. So this is not just a political message to the Parliament, which shows that what we vote on here is not a priority for the other two branches of the EU political landfill, but it's also a message to the women across Europe. Unfortunately, it is just brave gynecologists, NGOs, foundations, civil society organizations that fill in this void and that actually provide the services to these women that this regular government institutions are not providing. So once again, I would like to voice my demand. We need to provide the same standards across Europe and not hide ourselves behind the same line that we always use, and this is national competence. We cannot leave women on their own. Thank you.
Hvala, Fred. And we go to Greens now. Gwendoline de Bois-Confit. No, it will be Alice Kunke then.
Thank
No
you.
worries.
Yes.
Go on, Alice.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for our speakers being here with us and sharing your knowledge. With respect of the time, I will just ask one quick question. I'm from Sweden, and even for us, of course, I mean, we have a very strong right to decide over our own body, but there are movements influenced by the US and by financed by the US that are pointing in another direction. And I am especially worried about this conscious tool that they use and try to use. So I wonder to Dr. Grujic, What have you done any study or interviews with all these professionals within healthcare that are using the argument or leaning towards the right that they have to use their conscience and not helping women with their rights? Thank you.
Tusen tak. And from ECR, I have Margarita de la Pisa-Carrion. Alice. Yeah, now. Try now. No, Margarita, put on.
¿Ahora? Sí. Muchas gracias. Para poder defender...
Thank you. To defend the rights of women, you have to know women. I'm happy for Dr. Sanchez for having talked about the physical physiology of women, because this has to do with emotional, psychological, and other dimensions of women, which make us women. And a natural wish to become mothers. And for most of us, promoting the access to abortion as a right is really a nightmare. Abortion is something that goes against women. It's the utmost non-right. It's a manipulation in a sensitive moment such as pregnancies, because women are faced with insecurity, fear, senses such as you'll be alone, your life is over, what are you going to do, you'll never make it. So what we're going to do, if we analyze these messages, they're extortionists. They don't want their babies, or they can't have their babies. There's all these pressures. Defending women's rights is guaranteeing that they get all the support and not social pressure that points them to a decision that can't be changed, and many times they regret. So let me ask you, are you aware of what you're promoting? Because there is a reality that's hiding behind data. Resilient demographic growth, voluntary abortion choice. Progress is incompatible with not respecting women and life. We cannot put this in question. Who deserves to live and who doesn't? Would a first child have more rights to live than a fifth? When my mother was 45, I came into this world. Today is my birthday. Life is a gift. And being born is the greatest gift. So if as human beings we don't protect women in wanting to have their babies, where's society going? Mothers don't want to abort. We must avoid to be self-destructive in the interests of anti-natality big business. I hope this will animate the discussion.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, dear colleague. Happy birthday.
Birthday today. Happy birthday to you, Margarita. And I want to ask whether, yes, Karin has, Karin Olsson. Yeah, we continue. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and I will continue in Swedish.
What I'd like to start by doing is thanking all of the speakers for their very interesting points of view. We're witness to a situation at the moment where women's rights are in jeopardy in the world, and in some countries aid is being paid to other countries to promote certain attacks against women's rights, the rights to sexual and reproductive health around the world. And it's important to ensure that we don't threaten the life in this way. And I think it's making, in some cases, abortion into a business, making it more dangerous. We need a way of tackling this which places women's rights higher up the agenda, and we need a more feminized foreign policy. I would therefore ask you, what is your view of the situation? And I'd like to hear from Birgit van Holt on this, first of all, particularly what is required to reduce access to safe abortions. What is the relationship to women's access to safe care and full access to sexual and reproductive rights? So I'd like to have a little bit more detail on that.
Now, Gwendoline de Bois-Canfil.
Yes, I do think that, as Camille Gervais showed it, it's a mixed landscape, and we have some progress in some places and some difficulties coming back in others. And indeed, it's very linked to also a backlash in rule of law in general, as we can see in Hungary. But I have another concern more and more, and we discussed it not long ago with Mrs. Nathalie Kamen. I have the concern of the demography issue, and that we are going to start to hear a narrative about the fact that we are not having enough young people in EU, certain countries where there is a backlash on rule of law, instead of thinking of the sad environment that they give to their young people, they prefer to see only the problem of not having enough birth. At the same moment, we are not wanting migrants on our shores. That could be sometimes these people that we knew our countries. And I feel that the demography issue is going to come back very high as a burden on women's body. And once again, this will be the solution. So we're going to ask the EU women to have more children, and we are going to ask the others to have less children, because of course they are having too many children outside of EU and we're having too less in EU. And once again, the solution to these very international, deep structural problems that could be challenged in a number of ways are going to be about the body of women. So I think that for all our panelists, if they could elaborate on this. And then just a point of information, but maybe Lina will make it too, is that we are working in this parliament on a big text on treaty changes, not exhaustive treaty changes, the essential ones. And very clearly this commission said that one of the treaty changes that we wanted as essential, if we had to only choose a few in all of the domains, the one for FEM would be indeed the sexual and reproductive rights to be a European competence, as Fred Matic said, that we don't hide behind the argument of it being only a national competence. And we are seeing in AFCO that there's not a lot of interest in all groups about this, and that once again this is seen as an accessory question. We could come out in a few weeks with a text coming from this parliament not having this issue in it, and we have to fight in all of our groups about this, because I think that there's really a problem of AFCO mentality, and also because AFCO is one of the most men committee of this parliament, that this is, yes, it is important, but come on, not that important.
Well done, thank you very much. And the last voice will be to Lina Galvez Munoz, and with this I need to come back to our distinguished guests because we are running out of time. Lina.
It is just to confirm, sorry, I was voting in interest, so I couldn't listen to you, so I will not make any direct comment, but just what Gwendoline was saying, it was a very clear message from this committee they have not even taken into consideration. So this is, AFCO, of course, is the most male-dominated committee here in this parliament. The contrary of this one is like a positive and negative of this one. But I think we should really make something, because they have taken just few of our amendments, and the other day they were not even interested in listening in the what I have to say as FAM rapporteur. And so I think we really need to do something, and especially to make pressure to include abortion as a European issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lina. I just assure you that I, as a chair, I took a lot of effort to persuade the AFCO members to take on our side. It's really very, very difficult. But I will continue. You can count on me as well. So thank you very much. Okay, with this, we come back to our distinguished guests. And you have 3 minutes each. I don't know how you will make it. But the first is Birgit van Hoont, and then we continue with other guests. The floor is yours, Director.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions and for the very interesting discussion. Maybe let me start with the international dimension of the abortion, and just to start by indicating that UNFPA and the UN system does not comment on domestic policies or promote changes to the legal status. However, in 1994 in Cairo, the international community agreed that where abortion is legal, it should be safe and accessible, and it also stipulated that every woman is entitled to post-abortion care. Now, what we know from our work is that banning abortion does not end it, and it only increases unsafe abortions. We see unsafe abortions as one of the leading causes of maternal death in the global south. It causes up to 13% of all maternal deaths. And hospitalizes about 7 million women a year globally. According to our estimates, 45% of abortions that are carried out in the countries where we work are unsafe, and that unsafe abortion alone accounts for about 39,000 deaths globally every year. Regarding the question on the question of demography, fertility, pressure on women's fertility, and it's interesting because I had the opportunity not so long ago to speak also to the ACP, now the OACP as the African, Pacific and Caribbean States Organization. And the same anxiety that women here experience about this pressure on their fertility rate, that we're not producing sufficient children, they perceive it in the exact opposite manner. They ask continuously the question, what is this obsession with the fact that we are found to have too many children? And that it is up to states to empower people to achieve their individual reproductive goals, not to try to control women or to reduce their agency. So we must radically rethink the discourse, and I think be very distrustful of some of the narratives that we are hearing about demographic changes, and make sure that this does not undermine women's rights. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Thank you very much, Director. And now we go to Dr. Jasenka Grujic for her comments and remarks. You put the mic on, please.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to answer the MEP from Sweden. You asked me what we have done in order to counter those who do not perform their duties. I was working in the private sector when this happened for the first time in 2014, and I have to say that I was shocked. That was the time when the old doctors, professionals were still performing abortion. And when this conscientious objection was introduced, I need to say that this is a religious instrument, and this is my firm belief. This has nothing to do with human rights. So in 2014, we organized a very large roundtable discussion together with some NGOs. We discussed this issue, and we realized that this was an enormous problem, but that it was not recognized by the official institutions and by the majority of healthcare service, or they actually supported it. So even many medical doctors accepted this position whereby it is the right of the fetus that is in the focus. So they did not understand that we primarily championed the interests and the health of women, and they put priority on the interests of fetus. So this is the main problem. So our initiative gained a lot of support. Our proposals are still online. Proposals regarding possible regulation of this issue. Many of my colleagues stated that they would not perform abortion for religious reasons. And this is something that is very hard to resolve given the statistical data. So in many university clinics, including the med schools clinic, has these statistics whereby nearly 80% of gynecologists are refusing to perform abortion. Then in another town, all gynecologists are performing abortions. So it also depends on how you select people you employ in a certain institution. This is the only way I can explain this. I'm afraid that this can only be resolved through some labor issues. So if you are a gynecologist, this is one of your duties. It is a woman who is your patient, and you need to provide care to that woman. I don't know whether this response is satisfactory for you. I'm afraid that at the moment the medical community is completely divided in Croatia. Then the lady said that every life is a gift. I do agree. Among those living, every life is a gift. But also, please understand my point of view. I'm 72. I've been a gynecologist for a long time, and I will never forget the women who came to the hospital having sustained major damage because of criminally performed abortion, although the legislation was already in force. So when we talk about the gift of life, this is what I remember. So I do not champion abortion. My first role as a gynecologist was to do my best to reduce the number of abortions. Our initiative also came up with a proposal for a new legislation, which is not called the abortion law. It is called an act on overall sexual education, contraception, and abortion. Unfortunately, any woman who has to go for an abortion for any of the reasons will certainly do it, believe me. And in this segment, there can be no enforcing of anybody. So you cannot force anybody to be pregnant, nor can you force anybody to go for an abortion. So this is my response to your questions. How can we ensure an access?
One last sentence.
Evo.
Say hello.
Zaključit ću samo sa...
in conclusion, then, I will just address the issue of depopulation. I would like to say that as I wrote a book, I consider this issue, the problems with depopulation and contraception in Croatia, and I concluded that contraception is important in order to preserve reproductive health in Croatia.
3 minutes, I remind you. Thank you.
Vale. Bueno.
Well, as woman and gynecologist, I want to answer Ms. Adinolfi. The problem is that women has been ignored by the health system because everything that has to do merely with women has never been interesting to the health systems. That's why we never talked about endometriosis, and women sometimes had to wait for 8 or 10 years to get a diagnosis. So this is yet another example of a medical system that ignores women as such. Now, everything that has to do with maternity, obviously a gynecologist's role is promoting a woman's fertility that declines with age. But it's very important to have a holistic sexual and emotional education so that you learn about fertility, both in females and males, and how the lifestyle and external factors can influence us. And then the law, we need a homogeneous law on the preservation of frozen embryos and ova. And also the training of not just gynecologists, but also midwives. And these people should keep up the health education so that women know that if they become pregnant, if they don't become pregnant by a certain age, it's not that they're past their sell-by date, but they might have problems in later pregnancies. Now, to answer Ms. Dalla Pisa, having access to a secure, safe abortion is not incompatible with this natural desire of women to become mothers. This is also a question of the context in how we raise little girls, because there is this societal pressure that you can't be properly a woman if you don't become a mother. But why we want a safe abortion is that women who don't want to become mothers, they will anyway resort to abortion. So when abortions are not legal, they become dangerous, and very often the woman dies. So the gift of life is also making sure that women stay healthy. When a teenager comes to my office pregnant, I always find that it's a failure of our health and educational system, because I've been insisting on the importance of a sex and a well-being education since very early childhood, so that teenagers can then decide on their sexual activity and reproductive health on their own, without being subject to peer pressure and abuses, so that they can be protected even if they do decide to be sexually active. So that we have to prevent teenage pregnancies through education and contraception. Not so much that a doctor should actively promote it if it doesn't wish to, but at least to put the information out there. Because a lot of times women abort because, not so much because they don't want the baby, but because they feel that there are no structures to let them be mothered. So is this incompatible with a safe abortion law? No, we need to ask a different question. We need to ask what is in place to support women and in what conditions. Sorry for running over. We could talk for hours on this. Thank you.
Indeed. And the last of the speakers is Camille Gervais for 3 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will be very brief. I want to thank the members of this committee, first of all, for your unwavering support when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights, and especially with regards to the process currently underway in AFCO. I would like to recall that the reason why we absolutely need to remain hopeful is that regression and backlash that we're seeing is a clear result of the overwhelming progress which has taken place these past years. And I think regression is intensifying in some places precisely because we are seeing strides of great progress, and these are losses for the anti-rights movement. And again, I think the most effective way to counter regression is ensuring that progress continues. And so, in the meantime, I think we need to use the tools that we do have and the processes that we do have to ensure progress on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And it starts with very concrete things like ensuring that an EU directive clearly mandates sexual and reproductive health care access, including abortion, but not only, for victims of sexual violence. And I think you have an opportunity to achieve just that with the Violence Against Women directive. And to ensure that this directive also has very strong provisions on comprehensive sexuality education as prevention measures, because indeed it is important, as Mrs. Dinolfi said, to address the full spectrum of sexual and reproductive health and rights. Sexual and reproductive health and rights must absolutely become a priority for the next European Parliament and the next European Commission. And we have seen that regression happens through incremental steps over time. The challenge is in effectively preventing. This regression lies not only in monitoring the regression, and I think you have all very good access to information about the types of regression that happens and when these changes are looming. But I think the challenge mostly lies in unequivocal and prompt reaction and condemnation of the threats and the rollbacks on existing entitlements and on defenders of these existing entitlements. And I think this is where we need to improve, is the reaction part when we have these threats. And so the current process in AFCO would be a very, very positive step to not hide behind national competence and ensure that we have full EU capability to address the full spectrum of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we look forward to continuing working with you on these important matters, hopefully also during the next term. Thank you very much. I will stop here because I know we're running out of time.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to the experts for your excellent interventions, and thank you for being with us. And I'm sure this is not the last time we are meeting each other. So, yes, thank you. Have a good day. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, colleagues, we continue the committee meeting.